Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening. I'm Heidi Shoup, President of the World Affairs Council in Washington, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here to the World Affairs Council's filming of World Affairs Today. Thank you for joining us this evening for a discussion with Ian Morris, author of The Measure of Civilization: How Social Development Decides the Fate of Nations. Ian Morris is the Jean and Rebecca Willard Professor of Classics and Professor of History at Stanford University. A British-born archaeologist, classicist, and historian, he looks for broad patterns and overall shapes of history, looking at millennia, not election cycles, which is more common time frame in this town. Winston Churchill was reported to have said, "The farther backward you can look, the farther forward you are likely to see." In this case, Dr. Morris is going to help us look far into the future because he begins with the last ice age and compares societies east and west. This volume follows on his 2010 award-winning book, Why the West Rules for Now: The Patterns of History and What They Reveal About the Future. In that volume, he examined the intersection of technology and geography and a number of Western entrepreneurs in the 18th century that propelled the West's rise to power in the 19th century, and the development of nuclear weapons and the computer in the 20th century that kept it there. In the 21st century, that earlier book argued economic changes will call into question whether the U.S. in particular will remain so. In this second volume, the subject of this evening's discussion, Dr. Morris presents a groundbreaking numerical index of social development, comparing societies in different times and places, adapting the United Nations approach for measuring development based on 4 principal traits: energy capture per capita, organization, information technology, and war-making capacity. We look forward to a fascinating discussion. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ian Morris.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that very kind introduction, and thank you to everybody here for coming along on such a beautiful evening when I'm sure there's a lot of other things you could be doing rather than sitting in a windowless room listening to me. I'm very happy to be here, happy that it's such a beautiful day today. It was not such a beautiful day yesterday, as you probably noticed, and I managed to pick up a rather nasty cold. So, can you all hear me okay? So I'm a bit croaky tonight, so if I give out completely, that's why. It's not just out of boredom with the whole thing. I picked up a bit of a cold yesterday. So, okay, I'm here this evening to talk about the new book that was just mentioned, The Measure of Civilization, published by Princeton University Press a few weeks ago. And this book, it's based on the idea that the past is not a very good guide to predicting the future, but it's the best guide we've got. So what I try to do in this book is look at how we might be able to identify broad patterns in human history and then use them to get some kind of sense of what might come across the next 100 years or so. And the basic claim I try to make in the book is that there are these really big patterns unfolding across millennia at a global scale that do tell us something about the direction human history is going to be taking. Now, this book, it grew out of sort of 5 or 6 years of work that I'd been doing trying to answer what I think has become like the biggest question that world historians have been asking in the last 30 years. You know, people are trying to explain planetary-wide processes. And the question they've been addressing is one that's been knocking around now for about 200 or 300 years. Because back in the 1700s, Europeans discovered that they had a problem. The problem, I mean, as problems went, it was a pretty good one. They were taking over the world, but they didn't know why. Nobody quite understood why this was happening, when up till very recently it had seemed like Europeans could expect to be conquered by the Turkish Empire at any moment. So lots of European intellectuals started scratching their heads saying, well, why is this happening? And all kinds of new ideas bounced around. And the Europeans, not surprisingly, eventually came to the conclusion, I know why we're taking over the world. It's because we're better than everybody else. That is the obvious explanation. And the theory that sort of won out in the competition of ideas was that they said if you look back into Europe's distant past, you look back 2,500 years to the age of the ancient Greeks. They said the ancient Greeks create this unique civilization that is different from and better than any other civilization in the ancient world. And it's more inventive and more scientific, and it's about democracy and freedom and all kinds of other great things. It gets picked up by the Roman Empire, which conquers Europe and spreads this idea all around Europe. And then the idea gets passed down through the ages until we come to the pinnacle of Western civilization, which I'm sure you will recognize. So this theory, very satisfactory theory for Europeans. It had a very long, successful lifespan. But of course, in the 20th century, it gets increasingly challenged. And people start to point out all these things it doesn't explain very well, and particularly in the last 30 or 40 years of the 20th century, as East Asian economies really begin to take off and boom, lots of people start saying, quite sensibly, this theory that European dominance of the globe comes from the ancient Greeks and is basically locked in permanently by the excellence of ancient Greece. Well, this theory just doesn't seem to make any sense of the world that we're actually living in. This theory can't possibly be right. Well, result of that, you get these intense debates among historians, which sometimes get quite nasty and personal. Historians, some of you may be historians or know historians. Historians, delightful people. I'm one myself, delightful people. But they can get a little nasty over these arguments. And this one, I think, has gotten particularly nasty because a lot of the time the argument's a bit confused. And what I mean by that is there's confusion among the specialists over what exactly it is that we are trying to explain, what we mean by the key terms that we use, what counts as an explanatory variable, how you would know whether you were right or wrong. All of these things are kind of up in the air and messy. So when I started getting interested in this question, it seemed to me that the best starting point would be some way to clear through a little bit of this thicket of confusion that we'd built up. And because I'm the kind of person that I am, it seemed to me that the best way to clear through this thicket was with some sort of numerical tool where we could express quantitatively what it is we're talking about, and then we can compare these things more directly, and everybody is forced to be on the same page. And by trying to reduce the whole thing to numbers, not suggesting that putting numbers on things automatically makes you more objective than somebody who's looking at them qualitatively. It clearly doesn't. And in constructing this index I'm going to talk about, there's so many steps involved. This is as subjective as any other way of approaching history. But I think the advantage of it is it forces you to be explicit. So that if I say the score for this part of the world is 42.8, whatever that means, I have to then be able to explain why I think it's 42.8, not 42.9 or 42.7, and why it changes to 43.1 a few years later or whatever. I have to have reasons. I have to be able to be explicit. It allows other people to engage with what I'm saying. And if I've got it wrong, it makes it a lot easier to show that I've got it wrong. So I think there are some advantages, particularly in an argument like this one, where the whole thing has gotten so sort of messy and slippery. So, okay, I decided what we need is some kind of numerical index that will allow us to measure the development of societies in different parts of the world, compare their development over time, and see what sort of theory best explains the results that we get. The argument, as I saw it, the argument all came down to what I gradually started to call social development. And what I meant by social development, now I should say one of my pet hatreds in the world is people who read out PowerPoint slides to me, like I can't read myself. But I'm now about to do this to you, basically because I can. I've got it written down here what it says. But this is just to unpack this idea of social development a little bit, so you know what it is I think I'm talking about. Really, social development, the way I'm thinking of it, really comes down to society's abilities to get things done in the world. But putting it a little bit more formally, a little bit more fully, I'd say it's the bundle of technological, subsistence, organizational and cultural accomplishments through which people feed, clothe, house and reproduce themselves, explain the world around them, resolve disputes within their communities, extend their power at the expense of other communities, and defend themselves against others' attempts to extend their power. So it's a fairly broad concept. Basically, a group's ability to master its physical and intellectual environment. And in principle, at least, this is something that we ought to be able to measure and compare across space and time and look at how much social development different societies have got. Now, the reason I thought this would be a useful thing to do is that the older theories, these sort of the Plato to NATO theories, saying the ancient Greeks created this wonderful civilization that the modern West has inherited, and that explains the distribution of wealth and power in the world. These Plato to NATO theories, seems to me they're basically assuming that Western social development has been very different from development in other parts of the world, going back a really long time, certainly going back 2,500 years to the time of the ancient Greeks. Whereas the more recent theories which criticize the old sort of Greek-centered theory, they assume that that's not the shape of the history of social development. They assume, well, actually they assume a lot of different things, but some assume development has been much the same in many parts of the globe until very, very recently. Other people assume that development in other places, particularly the East, in China, has been higher than it was in the West until very recently. But the assumption is that it's a different shape of the history of social development. And also, I think a lot of the theories looking to ancient Greece, they assume a kind of long-term lock-in. They imply that Western dominance of the world, it was locked in the distant past and will continue into the future. Whereas the other set of theories generally assume that that's not the case. So, okay, these, as I see it, these are all quantitative claims, but the way they've been argued has been very qualitative, and that accounts for a lot of the messiness in the debates. So, okay, so that was all my thinking. This is what I decided I was going to do. 5 or 6 years ago, I started off, oh God, actually it's longer than that, 6 or 7 years ago, I started off down this path. And so my original plan was I was going to write this book, came out a couple of years ago, Why the West Rules for Now, for Strauss and Giroux. I was going to write this book, which would give you a sort of narrative, the storyline, explaining the whole shape of everything in world history. But then all of the details, all the serious stuff about the index that I would use to measure social development, I would just stick this up on a website, because now, of course, we are all digital creatures and nobody wants to do boring things like reading books and so on. We discovered there was actually a lot of interest in having it appear in book form. So I ended up redoing the index and expanding it and publishing it just a few weeks ago as this book, The Measure of Civilization, from Princeton University Press. And my plan with the remainder of my time tonight is to explain how this social development index works, and then say a little bit about what I think it tells us about where the world might be going across the next 100 years. So that's the basic plan. Now, okay, well, in the introduction, you heard the wise words of a famous part-time historian, Winston Churchill, quoted to you, about the farther backward you can look, the farther forward you're likely to see. And this is something I agree with very strongly. I think to understand social development, we need to look back a really long way into the past. And that is looking back all the way to the end of the last ice age, about 15,000 years ago. And the reason I say that is that to make sense of social development, I think you need to start by looking at the point in history when you first begin to see very different kinds of societies appearing in different parts of the world. And that's basically the end of the last ice age, when the world starts to warm up. And global warming, then as now, global warming has very different impacts depending on where you live on the planet. And at the end of the last ice age, the effect of global warming was that some parts of the world, well, actually, no, go back for a moment, all over the world, as the ice age ends and things warm up, plants and animals multiply wildly in a more benign climate. Humans multiply wildly as well because they eat the plants and the other animals. But the exact way it goes varies according to where you live. And there's a stretch of latitudes marked here as the Lucky Latitudes, although some people think they should be called the Unlucky Latitudes. But a particular band of latitudes across the planet where plants and animals have evolved that can be domesticated by the humans. Humans can turn into farmers. These lucky latitudes are the only places on Earth initially where this is possible. Humans begin developing agriculture and complex societies in different parts of the Lucky Latitudes. Their societies become very, very different from those of other parts of the planet. And there's two parts in particular, I think, that are especially important in this bigger story. One marked on this map as the hilly flanks. You see it toward the western end of the Old World. And this is the first part of the world where agriculture begins for good geographical reasons. And the societies that descend from this initial core, I call those unimaginatively Western societies. At the other end of Eurasia, out in what's now China, a couple of thousand years later, agriculture starts there as well. The societies that descend from that core, I call those Eastern societies. These Western and Eastern cores expand over time. And what you see in this pair of maps here, the dates, the numbers you see on the two maps are dates BC, and they show you the expansion outward of the eastern and western cores of farming over about 5,000 years in each case. Population grows as you move into farming societies. Farmers spread out and push back the hunter-gatherers that surround them, keep moving, taking over larger and larger parts of the world. As they expand over time, the areas within each of these eastern and western zones that are the most developed, these areas shift around as new kinds of geographical advantages appear. So what I do, for my index, I take it back to about 15,000 BC, toward the end of the last ice age, and I compared the eastern and western areas where farming initially began, charted their development over time, and looked at the most developed area within each of these regions as this changed over time, compared them with each other, calculated the development scores, and came up with my index. So that's the kind of theoretical framework behind it. How I actually do it, because this is the next problem. It's very easy to say, oh yeah, this is what I'm going to do. This will be no problem. You then discover very quickly, oh, actually, this is a huge problem. How on earth do I do this? So I stole an idea from somebody else, which is my solution to most problems. Usually somebody's already thought of the answer. In this case, I got my answer from the United Nations, because back in the late 80s, the wise people at the UN decided it would be kind of useful to have some simple numerical index that gave you one score. If you were, say, the director of an aid agency or somebody else interested in investing your money in different parts of the world, they said, it'll help if we give you one number which tells you how well the different governments in the world are doing at creating conditions that allow their citizens to realize their innate human potential. So the UN comes up with this human development index, and they hire a bunch of economists and say, we want a number, okay, go give us a number for each country. The economists all go away, and they're all very clever guys, and they realize immediately that the UN concept of human development, this is as shapeless and baggy as my concept of social development. Yeah, it's an infinitely big category, really. You can't measure that. The only thing you can do is narrow it down. And they said, what we need to do is narrow down human development to the smallest possible number of traits that can actually be measured that cover more or less what the UN means when they talk about human development. So the economists say, you know, in this case, Human Development Index, 3 traits will more or less cover it. And it's not perfect, but it'll be a snapshot. It'll do the job. And the traits they came up with, they said, if we measure life expectancy at birth, that's a really good trait to measure. Levels of education is another really good trait to measure. Real wages, lifetime earnings, another good trait to measure. And these 3 traits, they say, this doesn't cover everything we mean by human development, but it covers the important things. And once you've measured these 3 things, you can bundle them together, weight the traits in different ways, and come up with a score for each country in the world. And the UN does this every year, and you may know the latest one came out just last week, apparently. I haven't actually looked at it yet. But I've been told, as always, Norway is number 1. It's an incredibly boring index. Norway is always number 1. Now, what I wanted to do was sort of similar to this, a little bit different, because my social development is a bit different from their human development. But this is the basic idea of what I needed to do. So I thought about it a bit, and I felt that 4 traits would more or less capture what I wanted to talk about. And these 4 traits, they were energy capture per person, which I think underpins really everything in history. This is kind of the motor of history, energy capture per person. Then social organization, just our ability to sort of organize ourselves to accomplish things. Information technology, so how we're able to store information, disseminate it, to the ease of accessing our storage. And then sadly, last but not least, war-making capacity, because this has to be a big part of our story. Now, these traits, like the UN traits, they don't cover everything, but I think they cover most of what I mean by social development. Each trait has its own challenges, and there really are a lot of areas to argue about when you start doing this kind of work. Each trait has got its own challenges, but I think all four are measurable within tolerable limits of error, which I'll come back to in just a minute. Within tolerable limits of error across the last 16,000 years, which is what I need to do. So the way the index works is I go back to 14,000 BC, which is the last phases of the last ice age, and then forward, it ends in the year 2000 AD, partly because that's a nice round number, partly because that gives us just a few years since 2000 to sort of assess what's been happening since, which I think is quite useful. Now, to get the index done, I said, okay, let's make it nice and simple. Let's set a theoretical maximum possible development score for the year 2000 AD, the end of the story, maximum possible development score of 1,000 points. When the United Nations Human Development Index just goes up to 1.0, but of course it doesn't really matter what number you put on it. The biggest fights they've had over their index have been over the weighting of the three different traits. And as I looked at the historical evidence, it seemed to me I just had no particular reason to weight one of these traits over the other. Even if I did have a reason, there's no good way to do it. So I've ended up just weighting all four traits equally, which may be wrong, but as I see it, it's kind of the only way to do it. So 1,000 points is the maximum possible score. So 4 traits weighted equally, 250 points is the highest you can score on any of these 4 traits. And then you bundle them all together to give you your maximum, your actual scores out of 1,000. Now, talking about these sorts of things, I always find it makes much more sense if you look at the actual examples. So what I'm going to do, I'm not going to take you on a death march through the 4 traits, because you really would want to kill yourself if I did. But I'll just take you through one of them. And the one I'm picking is the second of these, the social organization. And I'm picking this because it's the easiest one to explain quickly. The technical problems, I think, are least, although there are some pretty serious technical problems with it. What I did to measure social organization, I took another shortcut, stole another idea. And this time I stole the idea from economists, who often will use the size of the largest city within a region as a quick shortcut to give you a sense of the level of complexity of organization of that society. And it's not perfect, of course, and I'm sure you can think of all sorts of ways you might want to object to using this, but it does seem to work reasonably well. And it is a nice, simple way to do things. So to measure social organization, what I did was just look at the size of the largest settlement we know of, going back to the late Ice Age, in these eastern and western regions. So the way this works, like I was just saying, 250 points is the highest possible score you can get on this trait, on each of the 4 traits. So the biggest city in the history of the world will score 250 points. Now this graph here, what we got here, we've got 2 pairs of columns. The pair over on the right is for the year 2000 AD. The blue column is for the Western world and the red column is for the Eastern world. On the vertical scale, we've got points on the development index up to 250 points. The red column at the far right, which you see goes up to 250 points. This is because the biggest city in the world up to the year 2000 was Tokyo, according to the source that I chose to use as my authoritative source, The Economist Pocket World in Figures. Fine little book, you should never leave home without it. And that assured me that in the year 2000, Tokyo had 26.7 million residents. Tokyo gets 250 points because it's the biggest city in the history of the world up to the year 2000. So 250 points for 26.7 million people means that 106,800 people would score you 1 point. New York City in the year 2000 had 16.7 million people. So you divide that by 106,800, which gives you 156.37 points, which is the blue column over on the right-hand side. So that was nice and easy, my scores for the year 2000, because the answers were there for me in the Economist Pocket World in Figures. Go back to 1900. Basically, I would pop back in century increments until you get very far back into the past when the intervals get a bit longer because we have less evidence. Pop back to the year 1900. In the year 1900, some debate among historians, but most agree London was the biggest city in the world. The blue column that you see over on the left. London had about 6.6 million people, roughly, in the year 1900. Divide that again by 106,800, which is what you need to get 1 point. So in 1900, the Western core scores 61.8 points. Biggest city in the East in 1900 is Tokyo, again, 1.75 million people. Divide that again by 106,000 people, which gives you 1 point each time. Tokyo scores 16.37 points, which is what you see the red column on the left. And so then basically I just keep doing this, about 1800, 1700, 1600, and so on. The nature of the evidence keeps changing. The margins of error, of course, fluctuate as you get into the archaeological material. But I keep going all the way back until we get down to settlements of 1,000 people, which scores 0.01 points. And going smaller than that just started to seem kind of stupid, so I stopped at that point. So what we get, you do that, and what you get for the one trait of city size social organization, you get this graph with dates along the bottom. I've got the sizes of the settlements up on the vertical column there. The red line for the Eastern world, the blue line for the Western world. You get a series of data points going all the way back to about 7500 BC in the West, when you, at the point at which you start seeing towns with 1,000 people in them. Now, this graph is a singularly unimpressive graph. You can't really see anything that's happening on it. So the next graph is just the same set of data points, but plotted onto a log linear scale, not long linear, as I entered at the top because I'm incapable of typing properly, a log linear scale, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. But what it means is we've got dates again along the bottom from 8000 BC to 2000 AD. On the vertical scale, if you look at that, you'll see each unit you go up the scale, you are measuring 10 times as many points each time. So you give 0.1 to 1 to 10. This is a great way to keep track of your credit card debt, by the way, as it mushrooms and grows exponentially. And what it allows us to see what's happening earlier on in the graph. So, okay, that's what I did for social development. Then I did it again for each of the three other traits. I bundled them all together to produce a single social development score, series of scores going back to the end of the Ice Age. To decide how well I did that, obviously what you need to do is buy my book and take it home and read it, and then you'll have all the answers. For the moment, you just have to trust me for a few minutes anyway, and then I will stop in just a minute. Okay, what do we get when we do this? This is the graph of social development scores that we come with. An even more unimpressive graph where you can see almost nothing going on here. Dates along the bottom, blue line for the West, red line for the East. Social development scores, 0 to 1,000 going up the vertical axis. This is the same data plotted again on a log linear scale so that we can see a bit more clearly what's going on in the earlier periods. And this, I think, is actually a very interesting graph. There's a lot of stuff going on here. First thing we see, I think, is the similarity of the lines. The blue, red, the blue western and red eastern lines. They're very similar, really. Second thing that's jumped out at me is the qualitative change in the data in just the last couple of 100 years. You get over to the right-hand side of the graph, and then it shoots up almost 90 degrees, dramatic increase since the Industrial Revolution. Third thing, which really surprised me when I was doing this, the blue western line is higher than the red eastern line for 90% of the time since the end of the Ice Age. I hadn't expected that result. But on the other hand, there's a period over toward the right-hand side of the graph where the red line is clearly higher than the blue line. And this is not a short period. This is 1,200 years, from about the 6th century AD through to the 18th century. Another thing we see, the lines generally rise. Social development has generally risen since the end of the Ice Age, but there are periods of stagnation and even collapse. And that, I think, that's what we need to explain if we're going to answer these big questions about why the West rules. And in the book I wrote with that title, the answer I came up with, the explanation for this, I suggested was basically geography was what drove this pattern. But geography in a rather messy way. Geography drives social development. But at the same time, social development determines what geography means. So that as development rises, different kinds of things become important in the geography, which drives the centers of wealth and power around the world, makes history so messy and complicated. But that's what I wrote about in Why the West Rules for now. I'm not going to talk about that this evening, though. I'm going to stick to the index and just say a few things about other stuff that I think is perhaps interesting about this index. Now, I mean, I'm sure you figured this out for yourself, but moving from the sort of evidence that we're working with is mostly broken stuff in the ground. Here you see me 20-odd years ago digging up broken stuff in the ground in Greece. Moving from broken stuff in the ground to a numerical index involves an awful lot of technical steps, all of which are open to challenge and debate. Because of that, because of all the technical steps involved, I mean, if you ask me, is this right? I mean, is this graph I'm showing you, is this true? The answer to that is clearly no, this is wrong. My graph is wrong. I worked for years on this and it's wrong. But I would then say quickly, before you should get up and leave, I'd say that is actually the wrong question to ask. You should not be asking whether it's wrong, because by definition, you are always going to be wrong when you try to do this. The question you want to ask is, how wrong is this? Is this so wrong that the entire pattern I tried to explain is actually misguided and doesn't reflect history at all? Or is it just sort of wrong enough that we can kind of live with it? And I, of course, think it's fine, it's wrong, but it's fine, it's not too wrong enough that we can live with it. And the reason I say that, say for the sake of argument, I have systematically underestimated Western development scores by 10% and overestimated Eastern ones by 10%. We could correct for that by just arbitrarily raising the blue line by 10%, dropping the red line by 10%, and seeing what happens. And this is what happens if you do that. You still have a pattern where the Western line is higher. Now it's for more than 90% of the time. It's higher by more than it was before. But the basic pattern to be explained hasn't changed. If, on the other hand, the error I've made goes the other way, and we should be raising the red Eastern line and dropping the blue Western line by 10%, this is the pattern we get. Now the lines are much closer together, but the blue Western line is still higher than the Eastern line for most of the time since the end of the last ice age. We've still got the same basic problem to explain. To make the problem go away, we've got to assume I was 20% off with these estimates. So if we raise the Western line by 20%, drop the Eastern one by 20%, then Western development is always higher than Eastern development since the end of the Ice Age. And the explanation I came up with is clearly wrong. It's unnecessarily complicated. Something had already happened in the Ice Age which locked in Western dominance. But this cannot be right. We can be absolutely certain this is wrong. Because if this chart were right, that would mean that the Roman Empire had higher levels of social development than Japan did in the year 1900, which cannot be right. Clearly, I cannot be systematically 20% off with my numbers, because that would produce insane results. So I'm less than 20% wrong. If we flip it around again, raise the Eastern scores 20%, drop the Western scores 20%, this time we get this graph, where the Eastern scores are almost always higher than the Western. Again, I've got the pattern wrong. This is completely different from what I thought I needed to explain. But again, this has to be wrong. This means that in ancient times, the Shang dynasty in China before 1000 BC was more developed than the Persian Empire was in 500 BC, which no ancient historian would agree with that proposition. It also means that in 1840, at the start of the Opium War, when the British shoot up China, China was more developed than Britain. Again, that cannot be right. So the numbers I'm throwing out can't be systematically 20% off. The margin of error is smaller than that. It's a margin of error that I think we can live with because if we move the margins out far enough to falsify the claims I'm making, we end up with results which just don't make any sense. So, okay, last thing I want to talk about, what I think is the most interesting thing about this index, what we can do with it. Because I think that if we succeed in creating a numerical index that identifies the broad patterns of history, we ought then be able to project some of these trends forward, make assumptions about our trends and see what happens if they play out. So the next graph I'm going to show you is what the future, the next 100 years will look like if we just make a very conservative assumption that development continues rising in the 21st century at the same speed that it rose in the 20th century. And if that happens, this is what the future is going to look like. You see here immediately the red eastern line catches up with the blue western line in the year, you probably want to make a note of this, the year 2103. Nice, precise prediction. As always told, if you're going to make predictions, you should be precise. So if we get to 2104 and it hasn't happened, you'll all know I'm a fool. I was also told that if you're going to make predictions, you should make sure that when they play out, you are already dead. So 2103 is like perfect prediction. But actually, the most interesting thing about this graph, I mean, obviously this is not really what the graph implies, but the most interesting thing I think here is not where the lines cross on the horizontal dates axis, but where they cross on the vertical axis, the development points axis. Because there, where they cross in 2103, that's at roughly 5,000 points. Now, to get from the cave paintings at Altamira to the World Affairs Council this evening, that took about 900 points. To get from us this evening to 2103, that's going to take 4,000 points. More than 4 times as much change as the world has seen in the last 15,000 years. Now, that, I think, is an extraordinary hypothesis to throw out there. And like I say, this is a conservative assumption. I mean, the change we've seen in the last 12, 13 years suggests that this graph underestimates the speed of 21st century change. So this is an extraordinary kind of thing. However, like I said, all that this graph does is show us what will happen if we play out a certain assumption. If we look back at history, and I have to whip back to my slides quickly because I failed to put them in properly. Look back at this long run of history here. One of the things I mentioned is we see how development stagnates at some points and even declines. Sometimes we get great social collapses, the fall of the Roman Empire, the Black Death in the 14th century. What if that is what lies in store for us in the 21st century? If you look back at these earlier episodes of the great, zipping back to where I was, these great social collapses, each time we see the same 5 forces involved. They always come up. We see mass migrations, bigger than the governments of the day can cope with. Because no one's able to cope with these migrations tend to drive epidemic disease. They merge disease pools that had previously been separate. Mass die-offs, often as high as 1/3 of the population dying. Governments collapse. We get state failure. As the governments collapse, trade routes collapse with them. There's no one to police these things anymore. Massive famines ensue. And then always in the mix somewhere, we get climate change. Now, you don't need me to tell you, these 5 forces crop up all the time. Any news website you go to, any news magazine you pick up, these 5 things will tend to show up in that week's stories. That's a rather scary future. And it seems to me perfectly possible that this is what the 21st century holds. We'll see a rerun of the great collapses of the past, but with one big difference. The Romans did not have this. If the Romans had nuclear weapons, I can guarantee, having spent a big part of my life studying them, they would have used them. We have nuclear weapons. As many of you will know, for every 20 warheads in the world in 1986, there's now only 1. That's the good news. The bad news is, of course, we can build more really, really fast. It seems to me that if we stumble into the kind of collapse that could derail soaring social development, I just find it inconceivable that it will not lead to nuclear war, which is a very bleak projection to make. One way or the other, it seems to me the 21st century is going to be a time of extraordinary discontinuities. The 21st century is going to bring either transformation of what it means to be a human being or a disaster that basically leads to the same thing, a transformation of what it means to be a human being. Okay, to wrap up then, the claims I've made. I've claimed that we can measure social development across thousands of years. The measurements are always going to be controversial and contested, but that's okay, because the errors are going to be within a manageable framework. The measuring suggests to me, as a lot of people have concluded, that we should expect the global balance of power to shift during the 21st century. We can probably expect the United States to remain the world center of gravity for the next generation, quite probably for the next 2 generations, probably not for the next 3 generations. Perhaps most important, it suggests that history really is speeding up. The 21st century is going to turn into a race between shifts in the balance of power, the transformation of history, and potential catastrophe. Now, the thing that sort of worries me a bit about the work that I've been doing is that these great shifts in the balance of power around the world in the past have always been accompanied by mass violence. There's not a single exception to this. In fact, I'm writing a new book about this at the moment because it seems to me it's such a big part of the human story. And there's an awful lot to worry about. But I bring you good tidings. I think it's all going to be okay. I think there's reason to be optimistic. When you look back across the long run of history, humans really have learned to manage violence very successfully across the last 100,000 years. As many of you will probably know, there's been a spate of books on this recently. Your chance of dying violently is roughly 1/10 of what it would have been if you'd been born in a Stone Age society, which is an extraordinary reduction. Now, largely because of this, I'm confident that the future is going to look like this. The future is not going to be nightfall, the return of catastrophe. The future, in fact, is going to be richer, safer, and more amazing than ever. So on that happy note, I will leave you. Thank you for coming along this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for an interesting talk. My name is Ryan. I wanted to press you on your definitions of East and West and what they might mean in the coming centuries. You'll have to forgive me, this is the first time I'm exposed to your work, so I may have the definition wrong, but it seems like it starts with geography, and then as societies develop and become able to do your 4 indicators over a larger geographic area, the expansion of the cultural, political practices associated with those early societies. In the context of globalization, and as societies seem increasingly able to do these things over a larger scale, and as there seems to be at least some convergence, arguably, in political, cultural, social practice, in 2103, when East passes West, what would that really mean, and is that something we should care about?
Yes. Well, as I was writing the book, it increasingly struck me. My book was called, the last but one book was called Why the West Rules for Now. And it increasingly struck me, as I was getting toward the end of the book, that was not actually what the book was about at all, which is a depressing feeling when you're an author, to realize you've written this entire book that was about something else than what you thought you were writing about. But it seems to happen to me quite a lot. But yes, I think, if I'm to understand the implications behind your question, that the conclusion I came to was that the whole thing about East and West, it's just not going to matter very much by 2103 if anything like this graph turns out to be the way the world is going, sort of up toward 5,000 points. The big story, as I see it, like I said, is that geography determines social development, and where you live in the world determines basically how your society is going to develop. But at the same time, how society develops determines what the geography means, and the meaning of the geography is constantly changing. And the speed at which it changes has been accelerating throughout history. And in a sense, globalization goes all the way back to the origins of the humanities. Humans spread out over the planet. Societies, after that, get bigger and bigger, more and more complex. You get longer and longer distance contacts. And the process of this is speeding up. So that by the 21st century, in our own day, early 21st century, we've reached a point where now, in some senses, you can say that geography has begun to lose some of its meanings. And I just flew out here from California a few days ago, and I had to sit in a tin tube for 5 hours. I took the red eye, which is always a mistake. It's just too short to get a good night's sleep. But I sit in this tin tube for 5 hours. I arrive in New York City. I feel like death. To me, it felt like geography has not lost much of its meaning so far. 5 hours in a tin tube. But of course, if this had been 100 years ago, this had been 1913, and you'd offered somebody the chance to get from San Francisco to New York in 5 hours, they would have jumped at that. They would have thought geography had already lost a lot of its meaning. And of course, in certain things that can be done now on digital platforms, space really has lost all its meaning. And my guess is that one of the big things in the 21st century would be the continuing collapse of space. And that is going to be one of the huge transformations of just everything. So that, if the world goes up to the 5,000 points thing, I think physical space as we conceive of it, I would suspect is no longer going to mean anything at all. And this, I think, is, in one sense, is a big lesson one of the big lessons you can draw out of this development index. At the same time, though, it's one of the big challenges to the development index. because what it seems to suggest is that everything that's been happening in the past 15,000 years is about to be swept away by the change in the world. The changes that we're seeing, in one sense, are just more examples of the kinds of processes that go back 15,000 years. In another sense, they are utterly different from anything the world has experienced before. So where that leaves us, I don't know. But I think that's where your question takes us.
Hi, thank you. To what extent, if at all, does your index measure gaps in development when you look at the north-south, the gaps north-south? And I'm thinking, for example, if you look at the social development measure that you used, if you used population size, let's say you chose Lagos and Sao Paulo, for instance, as cities, huge cities, but very different in terms of, you know, socioeconomic composition, etc., and the issues that they face from Tokyo. So I'm just curious as to how applicable is this index to looking at, to answering a very similar question that comes up, but in the north-south context.
That's a fascinating thing to get into, because I mean, like I said, I was comparing Eastern and Western development, trying to answer a very particular question. But there's absolutely no reason not to do this with any part of the world that you're interested in. And so I've actually just lately been fiddling around with the index quite a bit. I'm comparing the developments in the Americas with the Old World. And why are they in some ways very similar, but on different time trajectories, and in some ways quite different. It's very interesting. But yeah, I mean, the North-South comparison, I mean, Africa is a really interesting case for this, because at the very beginning of my index, say if you projected it back another 40, 50,000 years, oh, actually no, you need to go a little bit further than that, say 60 or 70,000 years, Africa would have the highest levels of social development in the world, because it's the only place where fully modern humans have evolved, in Eastern and Southern Africa. Then, of course, they start spreading out of Africa and move into the other parts of the world. And this, I think, is a great illustration of what I was saying during the talk, what seems to me to be the driving force behind the shape the world history has taken. Because Africa takes a lead early on in social development, but then as humans, and then also because humans evolve in Africa first, you get much more biological diversity in the humans in Africa than anywhere else in the world. And all the DNA studies have now confirmed this. And of course, it makes perfect sense because humans have been there longest. And so you might expect Africa to retain the lead in development over the long run because it gets this early start. But what happens is people spread out of Africa into these Lucky Latitudes regions across the Old World, particularly Southwest Asia. And when the Ice Age ends, these regions outside Africa are the only places where wheat and barley and cattle and all these domesticable plants and animals have evolved for people to domesticate. And so you get domestication happening first outside Africa. It then does happen independently inside Africa, in the Sahel. But it takes a lot longer there because it's harder to do. There's much fewer domesticable plants and animals. So Africans domesticate, turn into farmers, eventually start building their own cities and governments and all this stuff. But it happens later because geography changes its meanings. Geography allows people in Southwest Asia to build these more complex societies. As they do so, they then start sailing around the coasts of Africa and coming back into Africa. And so if like somebody had built a wall around Africa in 1000 BC, Africa would have carried on developing down its own trajectory and sort of basically lagging, what would it be, about 3,000 or 4,000 years behind the Western area because it gets its later start because of the plants and animals. But eventually it will catch up. It'll carry on going down the same path. But it can't do that because you've got these much more developed societies not all that far from Africa who start colonizing Africa and pushing back into Africa and eventually, of course, by the 19th century, taking over Africa. So I think the index is a really useful tool for looking at some of these things, and I think it directs our attention towards saying, what are the things we need to explain here about world history? So yeah, I think following up some of the things you're suggesting could be a really interesting exercise.
Hi, I'm Chris from the University of New Hampshire. I found it interesting that you specified a point in the future as 2103, but I wanted to get your opinion and have you elaborate on what you think the future is beyond that, maybe even hundreds of years more or 1,000 years more.
Yeah, now that's a difficult one to answer, as you can probably imagine. I think for the sake of argument, I mean, if we assume that everything I've said is correct, which is always a good assumption, by the time we get to 2103 in a world of 5,000 points, we are looking at a planet absolutely unlike anything we can imagine. The next if that's what happens, the next 100 years is going to see much more change than the previous 100,000 years. And in some ways, the last 100 years has actually already seen more change than the previous 100,000 years, particularly in what it means to be a human. Like if we could take somebody in the year 1900, or even better, the year 1800, transport them here this evening, drop them down in this room, they would be astonished by what they saw in this room. First of all, they'd look around and say, oh my God, there's so many old people in here. Look at them. And then they would look at you, and then they would say, oh my God, they're not only old, they're healthy. They're old people with teeth. What is going on here? They're old people who are not blind, they're not deaf. Their joints are not plaguing them with arthritis all the time. And by old, I mean like over 40. To any earlier age in the world, the way we live now is absolutely unimaginable. It's Harry Potter world that we now live in. Thanks to the interventions we've made in medicine, public health, hygiene, and just diet. I mean, diet is one of the big things. The human body now, typically we today, globally I'm talking now, not just rich countries, globally we're 4 inches taller, we live 30 years longer, and we're 50% heavier than people have ever been before in history. We are much more than 50% healthier than they've ever been before. We do magical things to ourselves. I mean, some of you in this room may be doing magic at this moment if you've had a pacemaker fitted. This is something, you fused your body with technology. We have, a guy ran in the last Olympic Games, a sprinter with no legs ran in the Olympic Games. He then went on and shot his girlfriend, which is very, so it kind of spoils the story slightly. But I mean, this is magic that these things can happen. And of course, we have only begun to scratch the surface here. I mean, these changes are going to go much, much further than what we've already seen. And it's easy to start throwing out predictions about precisely where they will take us. And a lot of people have done. And I love reading these, the science, technology futurists. But we have no way to know if any of these predictions are going to be right or not. My guess would be that the broad prediction that what the 21st century, the big thing it'll see is the fusion of human and machine. I would suspect this is going to be true. The question is, how far is that going to go? Will it go the way some of the technologists, like Ray Kurzweil in particular, suggest we'll get to the point where basically humans and machines are fused completely, and there's a sort of global consciousness out there on a silicon platform, and all we sort of sloppy, wet, carbon-based humans, we're going to be anachronisms 100 years from now. Whether it'll go that far or that direction, who knows? But I think this is going to be the big change. Because of that, my guess would be trying to answer your question of what it'll look like in a couple of 100, 300, 400, 500 years. I suspect that it's going to look something that we cannot begin to imagine. Because this would be like if we had been Neanderthals. We're Neanderthals sort of dragging our knuckles on the ground, and except that they didn't. Neanderthals were actually very smart. Their brains were on average bigger than our brains. They may have been able to talk, kind of. But a question like the one you just asked me would have been meaningless to a Neanderthal. We can be pretty confident about that. Because our world would just be totally unimaginable to Neanderthals. And I suspect that the world of 200-300 years out is going to be totally unimaginable to modern human beings. Unless, of course, we blow it all to pieces with nuclear weapons. Then we get one which is imaginable, but I would prefer not to imagine it.
I just wanted to ask just briefly about one of the 4 categories, the energy capture. When I saw that, I didn't really have an idea of how you calculate that or how you what it is.
Yes, yeah. When I give longer talks about my book, you may think that is not possible, that you could talk even longer about it. But when I do, energy capture is the trait that I focus on most. I didn't this evening because it is a bit more complicated, and all of these traits have their own problems. The energy capture, though, I mean, I think you're right to single this out because I think that's the most important of these traits. Because in a sense, some of my economist friends have suggested to me I'm being sort of unduly fussy and detail-oriented and having 4 traits. I only need 1, they say, because energy capture drives everything else. The other 3 traits are really about how people use energy, and the capture is the big thing. What I did for the energy capture, I looked, again, like I did with the social organization, looked at what is the highest level of energy capture on record in the year 2000 AD. It was the United States, where the average American burned through 228,000 kilocalories of energy per day, which is a staggering amount of energy we're burning through. You need about 2,000 kilocalories. If you have a reasonably healthy lifestyle, if you eat 2,000 kilocalories a day, you will maintain your weight and be healthy. Modern Americans on average consume into their bodies, I think it's 4,368, or maybe it's 3,468. It's a lot. Yeah, 3,468, which is a lot, which is why all of us have some issues with this. And actually, what we do, the calories we eat are relatively expensive calories. I mean, we don't just eat bread all day long. Most of us eat fancier things. And energetics people have this handy rule of thumb. They say if you lived entirely on meat, you can use this 10-to-1 conversion ratio. 1 calorie of meat that you consume has taken 10 calories of grains to feed that animal to produce that 1 calorie. So if you live just on meat, you would be consuming the equivalent of 35,000 actual calories. If you lived off lions, say your favorite dish is lion and all you eat is lion, you get another 10-to-1 conversion ratio for carnivores. So it takes 10 calories of cow to produce 1 calorie of lion, 10 calories of grain to produce 1 calorie of cow. So your 3,400 calories of lion would actually need 34,000 calories to produce. So we eat quite a lot, but the real thing we do with energy, of course, is use it to take the red eye to New York City and then come down to Washington, and to have things like the World Affairs Council, and to drive cars around. This, of course, is what we do with it. But anyway, we have this staggering energy consumption level. That scores 250 points. So that means that what is something like 912 kilocalories of energy per day per person scores 1 point for that society. In the year 2000 in the East, Japan had the highest level of consumption, which I think was a little over 100,000, so only about half what the US had. Something like 104 points that scores. You go back to the year 1900, difficult to calculate the minute you get back past the 20th century. But we got enough data to be working with. And you can calculate energy scores for the year 2000, for the year 1900, and do it again for 1800, and on you go back into the past. It's difficult to do, but actually the interesting thing is when you go all the way back to the hunter-gatherers, it's not that difficult within certain limits or margins of error. These guys almost certainly, on average, were capturing about 4,500 kilocalories per day. If they captured more than that, we would be able to see it in the archaeological record from the things they were doing. And they would consume about half their energy as food, the other half would go into firewood, simple shelters and this kind of thing. And then the most difficult part of writing these books has been documenting energy capture across the intervening 15,000 years. I can fix points in 14,000 BC fairly confidently, fix points in 2000 AD fairly confidently. It's just the pesky 16,000 years in between that's a bit of a headache. And so I spent a very long time on this. And just the last few months, I've gotten involved in this furious, actually very good-natured, but furious debate with an Italian economist who's calculated similar things but in a very different way. The amusing thing is that all the differences of what we do, we actually end up in rather a similar place, but which gives me some confidence that what I've done is not a total fantasy. It does bear some relationship to reality. But it is difficult to do because the nature of the evidence changes so much as you go back through time, through historical evidence, then archaeological evidence. But I think it is doable, and it is basically the driving force behind the whole of the development index. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.